close to me.
Stay behind! He died with honor.
No, Will. He just died. I'm tired of it.
You, me, all of us. We're all out there dying so they can stay rich.
Tax collectors coming around here, taking everything. We'll have nothing for the winter.
Girls, you know how to shoot one of these?
It's quite normal you got there.
Last time I checked, the gun don't care who's pulling the trigger.
You know they shoot deserters, don't you?
They runaways?
Please shoot.
And gonna die so they can get rich selling cotton.
That's why we left them.
No man ought to tell another man what he's got to live for or what he's got to die for.
I don't have the patience with 5 or 6 deserters hiding out in the swamp.
You ready?
Just hang them.
See anything?
He's out there. He won't miss this.
This fight's for our children and their children's children.
From this day forward, we declare the land north of the Pascagoula swamps to be a free state of Jones.
They're poor farmers, deserters, who, frankly, sir, don't have much to lose.
The winds are shifting, and you can't fight it this time.
There's plenty left to fight for.
Hey, I'm Matthew McConaughey. I'm portraying Newton Knight in the film Free State of Jones. Welcome to a peek behind the curtain of Jones County.
You cannot own a child of God.
No, you cannot.
The winds are shifting.
We gonna change some things.
Who are you?
The free man of Jones County.
It's as simple as that.
He was a man that stood for equality.
Newt was a reprobate.
Deserter.
A rebel amongst rebels.
He's a traitor.
The Robin Hood of Piney Woods.
A hero. It's amazing that there's so many people in this county that, of course, have heard the title Free State of Jones their whole life, but that knew nothing about where that come from.
Newt Knight actually he led a rebellion in Jones County against the Confederate, and then he started the first interracial family, Knight family, in Jones County.
Growing up in the area, my knowledge of Newt Knight was pretty limited to the old hand-me-down versions.
I think what we're really looking at here is a story that flies in the face of the lost cause version of the Civil War, which is that slavery didn't cause the Civil War and that all white people just supported avidly joining the Confederacy.
This history that's in the film is not your grandfather's version of the Civil War, but it's the truth.
Between 1860 and 1861, 11 Southern states withdrew from the United States and formed the Confederate States of America. They left or seceded in response to the growing movement for the nationwide abolition of slavery. Mississippi said, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. South Carolina cited hostility on the part of the non-slaveholding states to the institution of slavery. In March 1861, the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, proclaimed that the cornerstone of the new Confederate government was white supremacy, or as he put it, slavery and subordination to white people was the natural and normal condition of black people in America and the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. 3 weeks after the now infamous Cornerstone speech, the American Civil War began. The conflict lasted 4 years, had a death toll of about 750,000, and ended with the Confederacy's defeat. By 1866, barely a year after the war ended, Southern sources began claiming the conflict wasn't actually about slavery. Meanwhile, Frederick Douglass, a prominent abolitionist and formerly enslaved person, cautioned, "The spirit of secession is stronger today than ever." From the words of Confederate leaders, the reason for the war could not have been clearer. It was slavery. So how did this revisionist history come about? The answer lies in the Lost Cause, a cultural myth about the Confederacy. The term was coined by Edward Pollard, a pro-Confederate journalist. In 1866, he published The Lost Cause, a new Southern history of the War of the Confederates. Pollard pointed out that the U.S. Constitution gave states the right to govern themselves independently in all areas except those explicitly designated to the national government. According to him, the Confederacy wasn't defending slavery. It was defending each state's right to choose whether or not to allow slavery. This explanation effectively turned white Southerners' documented defense of slavery and white supremacy into a patriotic defense of the Constitution. The Civil War had devastated the country, leaving those who had supported the Confederacy grasping to justify their actions. Many pro-Confederate writers, political leaders, and others were quick to adopt and spread the narrative of the lost cause. One organization, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, played a key role in transmitting the ideas of the lost cause to future generations. Founded in Nashville, Tennessee in 1894, the UDC united thousands of middle and upper-class white Southern women. The UDC raised thousands of dollars to build monuments to Confederate soldiers. These were often unveiled with large public ceremonies and given prominent placements, especially on courthouse lawns. The Daughters also placed Confederate portraits in public schools. They monitored textbooks to minimize the horrors of slavery and its significance in the Civil War, passing revisionist history and racist ideology down through generations. By 1918, the UDC claimed over 100,000 members. As their numbers grew, they increased their influence outside the South. Presidents William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson both met with UDC members and enabled them to memorialize the Confederacy in Arlington National Cemetery. The UDC still exists and defends Confederate symbols as part of a noble heritage of sacrifice by their ancestors. Despite the wealth of primary sources showing that slavery was the root cause of the Civil War, the myth about states' rights persists today. In the aftermath of the war, Frederick Douglass and his abolitionist contemporaries feared this erasure of slavery from the history of the Civil War could contribute to the government's failure to protect the rights of Black Americans, a fear that has repeatedly been proven valid. In an 1871 address at Arlington Cemetery, Douglass said, "We are sometimes asked in the name of patriotism to forget the merits of this fearful struggle and to remember with equal admiration those who struck at the nation's life and those who struck to save it, those who fought for slavery and those who fought for liberty and justice. If this war is to be forgotten, I ask in the name of all things sacred, what shall men remember?"
The Civil War was about slavery. Some people might say states' rights. Well, yeah, the Southern states' rights to keep their enslaved workers. Some people might say economics. Yes, the desire for Southern planters to maintain an economy that relied on the labor of millions of enslaved people. But don't take my word for it. All we have to do is look at the statements different governments and government representatives made as they were leaving the Union themselves. A state like Mississippi said, quote, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world." A state like Louisiana felt, quote, "The people of the slave-holding states are bound together by the same necessity and determination to preserve African slavery." Or Texas, who said, quote, "The African race had no agency in their establishment, that they were rightfully held and regarded as an inferior and dependent race." Or we can take the words of the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, who in his infamous Cornerstone speech in 1861 stated that slavery was, quote, the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution, and that the Confederacy was founded on, quote, the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. To understand what the Confederacy was fighting for, all we have to do is look at what they said for themselves. On the opposite side of the Confederacy was the Federal Army, who was fighting to preserve the Union after the Southern states had begun seceding. And while the Army was not stating outwardly at the beginning of the war that they were fighting to free the enslaved, the shadow of slavery hung over every battle and every decision. Over the course of the conflict, the tenor of the war and the reason it continued evolved and became clearer over time. Reconstruction was a period following the Civil War that lasted from 1865 to 1877, though some scholars argue it began in 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation. During this time, the country was attempting to remake itself through a series of provisions, programs, and amendments that were ostensibly meant to ensure that Black people had civil rights. But this was easier said than done. You have to remember that just because the Confederates lost the war on the battlefield doesn't mean that their opinions changed about who Black people were and where they belonged in the social hierarchy. W.E.B. Du Bois described this period as a moment where, quote, the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery. Let's go to the thought bubble. In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, there was a glimmer of hope for what a new, more egalitarian society might look like. Black people in the South had the federal government on their side. And the idea was that the federal government would intervene to ensure that Black Americans could transition into life as citizens as safely and efficiently as possible. The thing is, emancipation fundamentally restructured Southern life for both freed people and white Southerners. The former planters and enslavers lost their source of labor and sometimes even their land. During the Civil War, Union General William T. Sherman's March to the Sea, a 285-mile trek through Georgia from Atlanta to Savannah, left a large portion of the state burned to the ground and devastated by his scorched earth total war approach. Planters and Confederate soldiers fled during the rampage, leaving a lot of land empty and untended. Sherman intended to parcel out this land to formally enslave people in Sherman's Field Order No. 15. This is where the famous 40 acres and a mule idea came from, though mules weren't initially part of it. Sherman believed that redistributing the land was important because it both punished Confederate landowners for their role in starting and sustaining the Civil War, while also providing newly freed Black people with the land and resources they needed to begin a new life in this post-emancipation South. Thanks, Thought Bubble. 5 days after Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox, effectively ending the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president, a Democrat and a former enslaver, became the new president. Johnson believed the opposite of what General Sherman proposed. Instead of taking land from former Confederates and giving it to the freedmen, Johnson believed in pardoning Confederates, letting them back into the Union and into government without asking them for basically anything. Johnson's views were at odds with Congress, which following the election of 1866 was controlled by the Republicans, who were at that time the party of the left, and who had a large enough majority to pass legislation and even override Johnson's veto. These radical Republicans, as they were known, led by Thaddeus Stevens, even impeached Johnson, though he avoided conviction by a single vote in the Senate. The Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution, were passed to establish Black Americans' legal protections. The 13th Amendment of 1865 formally abolished slavery across the whole of the United States. Many people get this confused with the Emancipation Proclamation, but the proclamation, if you remember, only freed enslaved people in the rebelling states. However, it's important to note a particular clause in the 13th Amendment. The legislation reads, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime, shall exist within the United States. And in fact, unpaid and underpaid labor remains a frequently criticized aspect of mass incarceration today. The 14th Amendment was adopted in 1868 and addressed citizenship. It reads, "All persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States." It also says, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the rights of citizens of the United States, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." Seems pretty straightforward on paper, but this amendment has not always been equally enforced, to say the least. Black people's rights were definitely abridged over time, and in many places, these rights were completely and violently subverted. Last but not least, the 15th Amendment, passed in 1870. This one gave black men, though not women, the right to vote. It reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." In order to enforce the three amendments and protect black people's rights, the Freedmen's Bureau, a coalition of Northern officials and Union soldiers, was set up throughout the South. Many Southern states hated the idea of formerly enslaved people having these rights, and having federal troops down there seemed like the only way to make sure these rights were protected. The Freedmen's Bureau was tasked with helping newly freed black people make a life for themselves, and they had a few ways of doing this. They legally recognized marriages between formerly enslaved people. Before, many enslaved people would have unofficial ceremonies, so actions like jumping the broom would be the only signifiers of lifelong commitment. Now, as citizens, states would recognize their marriage. Additionally, the Bureau helped to reunite families who had been separated during slavery, which over the course of 250 years had split apart millions of people. So, post-emancipation, the Bureau took testimonies of enslaved people and checked records of relocated individuals to bring families back together. But in one of its main roles, securing work contracts, the Bureau proved to be not so great. Many black Americans were forced into contracts to become sharecroppers or tenant farmers, which is to say, they would grow crops for a landowner in exchange for room and board. And while they were allowed to keep some of their crops for themselves, technically, they weren't paid a wage or salary for their work, and many of them were pushed right back into the clutches of the enslavers they had seemingly just escaped. Additionally, the Freedmen's Savings Bank, which was ostensibly created to help the formerly enslaved after emancipation, shut down within less than a decade, and the money of tens of thousands of depositors, equaling nearly $3 million, essentially disappeared. More than half of the accumulated black wealth by 1874 disappeared through the mismanagement of the Freedmen's Savings Bank. Just gone. Still, the Bureau did a pretty good job in assisting black Americans with their pursuit of formal education, something that black people had been advocating as central to the possibility of upward mobility. Historian James D. Anderson argues that the freed slaves were the first Southerners to campaign for universal, state-supported public education. The Freedmen's Bureau set up schools for black people of all ages. According to historian James McPherson, by 1870, there were more than 1,000 schools for freedmen in the South. Bureau initiatives also allowed African Americans to gain political power. An important outgrowth of the 15th Amendment was an influential black voting bloc that translated into real political power. In the years following the Civil War, leading to the turn of the century, 22 black people were elected to Congress, 2 of which were senators, Hiram Revels and Blanche Kelso Bruce from Mississippi. And it wasn't just nationally. Black people were voted into office in state legislatures across the South. According to McPherson, at the beginning of 1867, no African Americans in the South held political office. But within just a few years, about 15% of office holders in the South were black, a larger proportion than in 1990. Many of these newly elected black politicians had been soldiers in the Union Army. According to historian Eric Foner, for black soldiers, military service meant more than the opportunity to help save the Union, more even than their freedom and the destruction of slavery as an institution. For men of talent and ambition, the Army flung open the door to advancement and respectability. One of the main subjects of conversation among new black politicians surrounded the 14th and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution and whether there was room for women in politics. According to historian Martha Jones, black women moved in from the margins during this debate. They insisted that an intersectional analysis, one that simultaneously took up race and gender, was required if organizations such as the Equal Rights Association expected to move forward in the post-emancipation era. It was clear that black women existing at, in Jones's words, the nexus of sex and color, had a unique perspective and set of experiences that were making clear that black freedom should include freedom for all black people, not just the men. As black education and political power flourished in the late 1860s and early 1870s, African Americans faced white supremacist opposition. Much of this violence was tied to the formation of the Ku Klux Klan, led by former Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest, who served as the first Grand Wizard of the organization from 1867 to 1869, before Ulysses S. Grant led an effort that largely wiped them out by 1872, at least temporarily. And even though the organization of the Klan was gone for the moment, violence against black people was still growing. The presidential election of 1876 was tenuous. Democrat Samuel Tilden of New York earned 184 electoral votes, which was one less than required. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio got 165. However, election results in Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina were disputed. Alongside an elector issue in Oregon, these 20 electoral votes would decide the election. In what became known as the Compromise of 1877, Hayes was elected president on the condition that the remaining Union soldiers would be withdrawn from the South. This meant that there was no more federal protection for black Americans in the South. Millions of black people now felt completely and thoroughly abandoned. By the end of the 19th century, 2,500 black people would be lynched throughout the South, more than 100 black men and women per year. Sometimes people say that Reconstruction failed, but it would be more accurate to say that it was violently overthrown. It did not fail to succeed because black people were incapable of governance, as some 20th century historians and famous films like The Birth of a Nation seem to suggest. It failed to succeed because white Southerners did everything they could to thwart black mobility and opportunity. The U.S. could have gone in a different direction. It could have provided land, resources, and opportunity to millions of black people to begin to build a life for themselves after 250 years of bondage. Some resources that would have at least attempted to account for the generations of exploitation that black people suffered in this country. But a different choice was made, and we are still feeling the impact of that
county in
today.
The state of Mississippi. You're right in the middle of the Bible Belt. I think Jones County has more churches per capita than any other county in the state. My name is Wyatt Moles. I am from Ellisville, Mississippi, capital of the Free State of Jones, and I am a descendant of Newt Knight's grandfather. Newt Knight was an impressive countenance. He was about 6'4", good looking by the standards of the day. He is a primitive Baptist. He was a Bible-thumping Calvinist who believed in predestination. He feels that he's been chosen to do something. You know, he could load a double-barrel shotgun quicker than anybody. In other words, Newt is a badass. Newt stood for those issues that were on the right side of history. He was pro-union. He's against slavery. He's against secession, you understand? And he's all about doing the right thing.
My name is Joseph Hosey. I'm a forester here in Jones County. I was born, raised, and raising my children here. We're on Newt's old property on the southern edge of Jasper County, which at one point in time was a part of Jones County. And this area is known as the Piney Woods.
And the soil, you know, down here, it grows pine trees, sweet potatoes, and rattlesnakes.
Newt was a yeoman farmer like a lot of other yeoman farmers in Jones County who were subsistence farmers. So my name is Jim Kelly. I'm from Smith County, just north of Jones County, and I'm a historian. I'm working on a dissertation about Newt Knight.
We need to go ahead and establish that fact right now. The cause of the war was slavery. All you have to do is look at the journal of the Mississippi Secession Convention, and there it is. You know, they said, and I quote, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world."
I'm Victoria Bynum, the author of The Free State of Jones, Mississippi's Longest Civil War. I think one of the images of the Confederacy that often comes out of the Lost Cause version of the Confederacy is that somehow it was a government of the common white man. The Confederacy was the government created by and for the slaveholding class.
Newt, they go into the Army in 1861.
Which was really not an unusual thing. A man had a lot to lose by refusing to join.
A lot of them had pressure to enlist. Newt says that he joined only as a medic or an orderly and went to war.
They're at the Battle of Corinth, you know, in 1862, getting the hell blown out of them. That's when the Confederate Congress, in October of 1862, passed a piece of legislation which was known as the 20-slave law.
And this was something that really struck at the heart of the class antagonism between the planters and the yeoman farmers.
That law exempted from military service one white male on every plantation that had 20 or more slaves. If there were 40 slaves, 2 white males got to go home. If there were 60 slaves, 3 white males got to go home.
And that didn't go over well with the agrarian class, with the yeoman farmers, who were already suspect about the motives behind this war.
You have white men who are seeing themselves fought off to fight a war that many of them begin to perceive is really a war over slavery, which it was. They're fighting to save slavery. They're losing their lives to save slavery. They're not slave owners.
This is when Jasper Collins says, "Rich man's war, poor man's fight."
And then he and Jasper Collins, along with thousands of other soldiers, yeoman farmers primarily, from the Piney Woods, came back. They deserted and came back. Newt was the same as tens of thousands of Confederate soldiers who deserted. We know now there's more soldiers lost to the Confederate Army from desertion than from anything else, including disease, including death on the battlefield.
My name is Dorothy Knight Marsh, and I'm Newt Knight's great-granddaughter. During that time of the Civil War, the Confederates felt like they could do anything that they wanted to. So since all the husbands and sons were gone, so they just came through the area and just ransacked the homes, burned some of the homes, took all the food and the cattle they had to supply their needs.
When the Confederate government begins the tax in kind and begins taking people's corn and horses, and that's when it becomes a problem, and that's when they become anti-government, anti-Confederate.
In fact, we know of an account, where one Confederate soldier walked all the way home from Vicksburg back to Jones County, and he got home, he discovered that his wife had died. She had starved to death. She had given the food to the children.
I tried to put myself in his shoes and think about what that must have felt like, and I concluded that it would make a unionist out of you every time.
All of this really led to the creation of what we call the Night Company.
That's where, Newt springs into action. He raided Confederate supply houses and warehouses. He loads the wagons with corn. He redistributes the corn that had been taken from the people to begin with. He becomes kind of sort of known as the Robin Hood of the Piney Woods.
And the Confederates begin to send conscript officers to round them up and send them back to the front.
At that point, they were organized, and they were organized also around an ideology. They swore allegiance to the U.S. government in that meeting at Smith's store, where they declared themselves to be the Night Company.
The deserters, Newt Knight and the company, used the swamps as a place to hide out from the Confederate authorities.
Here off of Leaf River, this is Cedar Bend. This is where Newt did his hiding. I could see where Newt would use these to his advantage. Mostly water. It's hard to track people in water.
The swamps were full of runaway slaves and deserters from the Confederate Army.
These two groups that are both being oppressed are going to find one another, and that's where they make common cause.
The swamps were like a great geographic feature of the land here that made it possible for them to carry on this war, because they could fight, and then when they were overwhelmed with numbers, they could retreat to the swamps, get away from the bloodhounds, and get away from the cavalry. In the swamps, a lot of people, white and blacks, came to their aid.
And the women played a very active role. You know, they put out red pepper, they put out broken glass to hold off the dogs. They also had horns that they would blow on to warn the men whenever the Confederate officers or Confederate troops were in the area. And so you had a whole community that was organized around the Knight Company.
Particularly a former slave named Rachel.
Well, you've always heard those stories being passed down as we sit around and people start talking, and his name and Rachel's name would always come up. All we knew is that we had a great-grandpa who was white and Rachel, who was a mulatto woman. He was really, really smitten by her, I can say. She was a very smart woman. She was a beautiful woman.
So Rachel was an important figure in the swamps themselves. She was out there, she was supplying them food, she was working as a spy, and she became romantically involved with Newt Knight, and eventually, toward the end of the war, began to have children with him. There was genuinely a relationship here that some have characterized as a common law marriage.
So even though we know they didn't go to the courthouse and get married, the perception was that they were married in a common law marriage, and fathered a mixed race family with her that he didn't hide from. Very, very radical and very dangerous.
He made his own rules. If he decided he was going to have the first interracial community, he did. If he was going to have an interracial common law marriage, he did. So it didn't matter what other people say.
When I was, in college and so forth, I would say things like, well, Newt, he distributed food to starving people, and he was known as the Robin Hood of the Piney Woods. But then someone would always come back and say, yeah, but he was married to a black. He was married to a black, as if that negated everything.
1865, the war is over. The Southern armies are devastated. The North has won the Civil War, except that they allowed the former Confederates to go right back into office, to go right back to the State House, and they immediately passed a series of laws that put blacks right back in a second form of slavery, the Black Codes.
If you really want to see proof of Newt Knight as a Unionist, all you have to do is look at his career during Reconstruction. He rescues children who are still being kept in slavery. 1872, he becomes a Deputy United States Marshal. That meant he would have been registering African Americans to vote. 1875, he is appointed by Governor Ames as a colonel of a militia regiment made up of all black soldiers.
The official war was over in 1865, but there was a shooting war that continued, insurgent war, if you will, by white supremacists who did not want to accept the outcome of the Civil War, and they were determined to overturn it at the voting booth. And this time is when Newt was really called upon by the Republican government to help enforce the law of the land, the 14th and 15th Amendments. As it became apparent that the white supremacists were going to use violence to overthrow the election, and that the national leaders were not going to send troops to help prevent this, Newt took it on himself to provide for Rachel and her descendants by giving them, deeding them, a big tract of land.
We're here at Newt Knight Cemetery. It was illegal for black and white to be buried in the same cemetery, and obviously to be married to one another, and he defied all that.
What I see in regard to Newt Knight and Rachel, their relationship, and by extension his relationship with the entire mixed race community for his entire life, is an evolution toward the very end of this, where Newt Knight, when he dies, has himself buried right next to Rachel Knight, next to the woman that had played such an important role with him during the war and during Reconstruction, and in being the mother of 5 of his children. A very interesting end to a very fascinating story is they're being buried together in an integrated cemetery in segregated Mississippi.
The situation with Newt and Rachel sort of was validated in a sense in his obituary. In the Ellisville newspaper, it talked about, you know, everything that he had done during the war was noble and understandable, except that he ruined his life by marrying a former slave, Rachel. But they used the word marry. That's where he's buried today, and he's the only white person in that cemetery.
On his footstone, he has a Sal, his shotgun, that he carried everywhere with him even after the war. And an inscription that he lived for others, you know. And that sums who Newt was perfectly.
My name is Florence Knight Blaylock. Newt and Rachel is my great-grandfather and great-grandmother. Now, we have a family tree that we drew up. It's a big one. This is our first family tree that we drew. This is Rachel. We have her as the trunk. Now, we don't have Newt on here, but it all children of Newt Knight. You can just look and you're going to find more and more and more. And the tree, as Dorothy says, the tree got many branches. A lot of these people went up north, they became Mormons, and then they came back.
My grandmother, she's always shared a part of or her family history, but some parts were a little taboo.
You got the darker skinned Knights, which we call the Black Knights. You got the half white ones, which you call us, and then you got the white ones. And the twain will never come together. It's just the way, that's just the way it is.
My name is Eunice Smith. I come through the line of Harriet Carter Knight Ward, so that would be known as the Black Knights. I just want us all to be able to be unified. No, you know, white, black, mix. We are one, and that's my hope.
Growing up in the South, you know, you hear a lot about your heritage. It brings things to mind like grits and sweet tea. At the same time, you know, it brings to mind things like slavery and racism. And Newt, he gives you that little shining light of an example of that we didn't all go along with it. You know, we weren't all of the same mindset.
Inherent in the Civil War is a promise, and it's a promise of freedom. And that promise was immediately broken. And people have struggled to fulfill that promise for an entire century and are struggling to fulfill that promise still. And I think all Newt Knight did was struggle to make sure people kept their promise.
For over 150 years, those who embrace the mythology of the lost cause, they have endeavored to suppress Newt. But it's like the heart that keeps beating from under the floor. He won't go away. Someone once said that no army in the world can stop an idea that's time has come. Newt's time has come.
And Newt Knight and the entire Knight Band, the families that all joined in that, reminds us that, that people had a perspective on the war, that people understood it from a different perspective than the rhetoric of the Confederacy itself. There were always Southerners who supported the Civil Rights Movement, who very much wanted to see a changing South.
This is a great story. We can embrace this story because it tells the truth, and it's an American story.
Something I'm very proud of. I've never told anybody where I'm from without saying I'm from the Free State of Jones.
Black, white, rich, poor. This fight is for everybody. It's for our children and their children's children.
I'm ready.
Free State of Jones.
The Free State of Jones. Legend holds that this sparsely populated region of Mississippi actually seceded from the Confederacy during the Civil War. But is this historical fact or local myth? And the leader of the Free State, Newton Knight, was he a coward, a deserter, a traitor to the South who became a murdering bandit? Or was he a man of courage fighting for justice against an oppressive government? What really happened more than a century ago, deep in the piney woods of Mississippi?
Cotton in 1860 was the nation's most valuable export item, and Mississippi was the nation's leading cotton producer. So it was a wealthy state. But Jones County did not produce that much cotton. It had the smallest slave population of any county in Mississippi.
They don't really own a lot of slaves here because that's not what these people were about for the most part. Most of them were small farmers with no slaves. Probably 80% of them, the farmers in Jones County, didn't own one single slave.
These are really, I call them the kind of yeoman farmer class, those who are trying to ascend up the economic ladder. They were not going to have a huge cotton plantation.
The poor and working class farm families of Jones County have little interest in growing cotton. But the cotton plantation owners and business leaders of Mississippi do. Any threat to their slave-based economy will call for a decisive response.
Mississippi Fire Eater politicians hated Abraham Lincoln, so when he's elected president in the fall of 1860, the Mississippi governor, John Pettus, called for a secession convention in Jackson.
Jones County elected a pro-union, anti-secession delegate for the convention. But during the convention, the delegate betrayed his constituents, voting with the majority to secede from the Union.
They supposedly burned him in effigy in Ellisville because the people weren't too happy about the fact that he votes for it, and in return, he got a job in the Confederate government as provost marshal over Jones County, which was handy because he didn't have to go to the front.
Once Mississippi seceded, it had to begin mobilizing for war. And initially there was a great outpouring of enthusiasm. More men volunteered to serve than the state needed. Many men from Jones County did go off and they fought in the Confederate military. But in the course of the war, Jones County became most famous for Newton Knight and his company of Confederate deserters who went on to fight a guerrilla war against Confederate officials.
Newton Knight apparently joined willingly. He is listed as a volunteer and as a private. And he served very well during, I think, the first year, and then he was released from service by one of the generals. And there's no record of exactly why. It may have been because his father died.
Newt Knight's release doesn't last long. As casualties mount, the Confederate Congress passes a Conscription Act in 1862, drafting thousands of Southern men between the ages of 18 and 35 for military service.
The draft was incredibly unpopular. To many Southerners, especially people who accepted the states' rights ideology or the states' rights doctrine, it seemed as if they had replaced one tyrannical national government with another.
A lot of the people in the community were sort of like, we're not sure who the enemy is. They told us that it was the North, that it was the Yankees, but the Confederates, conscript officers are coming and getting our sons. Some of them are not even of age. Houses were burned, barns were burned. It was a vicious conscription act.
Then next thing you know, they were conscripting us. They just come around with a squad of soldiers and took them.
Newt only agreed to go in as a medic, and everyone agreed that he went in as a medic. Of course, when you get at the front lines and they need another man on the, with a rifle, then you become a frontline soldier.
Newt Knight is promoted to sergeant and takes part in the bloody Battle of Corinth. The Confederates are defeated, and even veteran soldiers are shocked by the carnage they've witnessed.
After Corinth fell, many men in Knight's company simply concluded that the war couldn't be won, or that the cost of continuing the war was too great to bear, and they went back to Jones County.
Newt Knight and others are further disillusioned when the Confederate Congress passes the 20 Slave Law, exempting anyone who owns 20 slaves from military service.
Jasper Collins was a close friend of mine. This law, he says to me, makes it a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. I'm through. He threw down his gun and started home. Well, I felt the same way about it, so I started back home. I felt like if they had a right to conscript me when I didn't want to fight the Union, I had a right to quit when I got ready.
For poor people, people who didn't own 20 slaves, it seemed as if they were fighting to protect somebody else's property, that they were being asked to bear a disproportionate burden.
Guys like Newt felt like from the beginning that they were sort of being railroaded into this war. And a lot of these guys started to realize a couple of things. Everyone with any political pull, any local office, or anybody that the president said, you know, make exempt, they were exempt from the fighting. So that left the poor white yeoman farmers to be the soldiers that are going to fight and die. And they start to realize, in fact, Newt and Knight began to realize, you know, that they were slaves. We're not picking the cotton, but we're the ones that are going to go die so they can keep the slaves picking the cotton. And we really don't want to do that. And so a lot of them begin to desert. Thousands of them are deserting.
Nobody, basically for the first year of when desertion started, objected to it much. It was as the war went on, efforts to capture deserters and punish them became a real goal of the Confederacy because they were just losing so many.
In early 1863, Newt Knight is again seized by Confederate forces.
We know that he was tortured, which probably means, you know, 39 lashes, like they would give a slave. His comrades said he was treated very cruelly. He was put in chains, and he was under arrest during the Vicksburg campaign.
But Newt Knight deserts again, setting out for Jones County. He will never be rearrested. A few weeks later, the strategic port city of Vicksburg falls. The tide of the war has clearly turned. Desertion rates increase. All across the South, Confederate military authorities confiscate household goods, livestock, and produce. Thousands of Confederate soldiers return home and find their families literally starving. Facing such hardship, Serena Knight, Newt's wife, flees with her children to her relatives in Georgia. Newt Knight returns to find an empty home.
I believe that Newt Knight came to hate the Confederacy, and the Confederacy really hated deserters like Newt Knight. To the Confederacy, he was a traitor, but he left them to take care of his family. The Confederates were robbing our people, his wife. They were robbing other families of everything they had, cloth, food, and leaving children behind with nothing to eat. I can't see how you can call that being a traitor. He went home to take care of the families that they have robbed.
We saw we had to fight, so we organized this company and the boys elected me captain.
When we look at the Civil War and we look at the Knight Band there, it's interesting to trace the evolution of their opposition to the Confederacy. You know, many men would desert and then just to get a rest, go back and plant crops, make sure their families were okay, and then they'd go on back. But these men who joined the Knight Band, part of the reason why they formed the band was because they were determined they were not going to go back into the Confederacy. That was it. In fact, they were going to fight against the Confederacy.
Knight's company. Many different interpretations about what motivated Knight's men to fight. Some have argued that Knight was simply a desperado, an opportunist. He was going to take advantage of wartime chaos to settle old scores, to enrich himself and his followers. Others have argued that he was a kind of Robin Hood figure, that Knight was a champion of poor yeoman farmers who were struggling to resist the power of Mississippi's wealthy slaveholders. Still others have argued that he was a dyed-in-the-wool Unionist who had opposed secession from the beginning, and he was fighting a campaign to free Jones County from Confederate rule.
He, along with Jasper Collins, formed this gang of at least 100 men, and that's what they would do. They would hide out, and then they would attack supply trains and take their food and whatever they could get back to the people in the communities, because they were really destitute.
They attacked warehouses where Confederate officials were storing food. They attacked tax collectors. They attacked people who were sent into Jones County to round up deserters. On at least 2 different occasions, the Confederate military sent men into Jones County in an attempt to crush Knight and his company.
At a certain point, when the desertion levels had gotten pretty high in Jones County, a man named Amos McLemore, he was a major with the Confederate Army, was sent in to gather up deserters, arrest them. And he was taking dinner at the home of Amos Deason in what's now known as the Deason House. And on that night, Newt Knight and 2 of his companions, this has never been proven, but is generally accepted even by Newt Knight's own son, they murdered Amos McLemore rather than risk being hauled in as deserters.
Newt Knight has always been blamed for the murder of McLemore, but he was never charged with a crime. They don't know who shot McLemore, and that's why they didn't charge Newt Knight with a crime.
In the spring of 1864, Confederate Colonel Robert Lowry leads 2 regiments of infantry and 200 cavalrymen into Jones County to pursue and execute members of the Knight Company.
He was rough beyond reason. He hanged some of my company he had no right to hang.
2 teenage boys from Knight's company are hanged. Today, a marker in Jones County recognizes them for being unjustly killed for their honest convictions. Despite never finding Newt Knight and never capturing any of his inner circle, Lowry proclaims his expedition a success and withdraws his men from Jones County, never to return.
The Confederates felt justified in their rebellion against the United States, but they were not about to tolerate a rebellion within the Confederacy. They hated the very idea of Newt Knight and the Free State of Jones. General Leonidas Polk wrote President Jefferson Davis explaining to him that these Southern Yankees had taken over this part of the state because the Knight Company had raised the United States flag over the courthouse in Ellisville. They've overturned the Confederate government there. The Confederate officials were on the run, the tax collectors were on the run, the sheriff was gone. In effect, they had seceded from the Confederacy because it was an independent government now.
I don't see a stand taken against all authority. I see a choice made here that the Confederacy is not the legitimate government. It is destroying us, destroying our lives, and they do support the U.S. government, and they said so. And I think it's important historically to recognize that.
Unlike other renegade bands of deserters, Knight and his men accept and support runaway slaves. One of these was Rachel, a former slave of Newt's grandfather.
She became Newt Knight's ally during the war, and then later, of course, entered into a relationship with him, has several children by Newt Knight. And that's where the 2 stories, the one story of an insurrection and the other story of a mixed-race community, I mean, that's where they converge.
There was no color line for Newt, especially after the war. We see that because he's wide open with this relationship and poses for pictures proudly. You can see him in their Sunday finest with one of his grandsons, in fact. And it's just amazing to see that at a time when that wasn't popular in Mississippi at all, and he does it anyway. When did the Civil War end? Some would say it's still not over, because there's still a lot of work to be done. There's still a lot of healing that needs to come. What we do know is it doesn't end in 1865 like it says in the books, because there's a shooting war that begins as soon as the war between the North and the South ends. And that was a war of violence against the Unionists, white Unionists, and against African Americans.
In order to recreate the life they enjoyed, the all-white Mississippi legislature passes into law the so-called Black Codes, denying the civil rights of newly freed slaves.
What the Black Codes essentially do is it sets up a state for Black people and white Southerners that most closely resembles slavery. So, for instance, Black unemployment is criminalized because you are considered a vagrant. Black and white people cannot marry. I mean, so there are a number of slave codes that now become Black codes, and Mississippi is the first state to enact it in November 1865.
With Mississippi and other former Confederate states unwilling to respect African Americans as full citizens, the period of radical Reconstruction begins. Union troops continue to occupy southern states to maintain order. High-ranking Union officers are appointed as military governors in each state. Mississippi's governor was Adelbert Ames.
He bought into the idea of equality and social justice in Mississippi, and he fought for that, and he used people like Newt, native white Mississippians who were on the ground in different parts of the state to try to help him do that.
You really have an effort going on there to restructure Southern society, to create, to grant citizenship rights, not just freedom, but citizenship rights to former slaves. And Newt Knight appears to be a part of that. He was immediately given political appointment. He was a relief commissioner in 1865, and as relief commissioner, he had several orders coming to him from Northern Union officers who were stationed in Mississippi.
They're given orders to him to do things like rescue slave children from families who are not admitting that slavery is over, to help destitute women, to help poor people in general, distribute grain, bacon, food to people that were starving. After the war, the landscape was pretty barren because the farms were in such bad shape.
But in the mid-1870s, the Reconstruction period comes to an end, and so do the political and social reforms that Reconstruction brought. Soon, many of Mississippi's pre-Civil War leaders returned to power. The reforms meant to give freed slaves all the rights of citizenship are quickly rolled back. Newt Knight recognizes what these events mean for himself and his family.
He deeds 160 acres of land to his African-American wife, Rachel, which was really unprecedented in those days, because he knew that this tide was changing, and he knew that he might be killed because there were all kinds of assassination attempts against him.
Because of his mixed-race family, I think Newt Knight moved out of politics. He crossed the color line. He shocked society by doing it openly. And again, in line with this personality that said, if I'm going to do it, then it's going to be all right. I'm going to do it openly.
He retreated to the Hilltop Farm, which is a beautiful, beautiful ridge of land with a creek behind it and this awesome view of the setting sun.
After emancipation, my grandmother and her family moved from the old slave plantation in Jones County to Jasper County. They went with one of the younger Knights who did not believe in slavery.
So reads a passage from Mississippi Girl, the 1952 autobiography of Newt's daughter, Anna Knight.
Now, Newt Knight himself was part of the creation of a public school system around 1870, and when he tried to send his mixed-race children to the local public school that was being established, He was told his children could not attend there because they were mixed race.
Unable to find a school in her area, Anna Knight travels to Chattanooga, Tennessee, where she will attend school and live with a missionary couple from the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
And they just took her in and tried to get her an education, but the school where she went to, they wouldn't accept her.
Other members of the school complained that they were not going to have their children attending school with someone who was really black, you know, because this is segregation. And so the Seventh-day Adventist Church itself took and privately educated her and still continued to support her.
Anna later adopts the Seventh-day Adventist faith, becomes a nurse, and upon graduation in 1898, travels to India as a medical missionary.
And she came back to this area to start her school in Gaetano, near Gaetano, and that was a school that Newt helped her build, her uncles helped her to build, so that the children, the mixed race children in the community there could go to school. She did a lot for this community. She did a lot for her people here, a lot for this community. And
not only here, she went further in Mississippi in different areas. Summerall, where there was family. She taught her sister a lot, and her sister kind of picked up when she left.
After training her sister, Grace, to teach in the local school, Anna Knight moves on, establishing schools across the South.
Newt believed in helping people, no matter who they were. If Anna wanted to get an education, he supported her in whatever she wanted to do. If she wanted to come back here and start a school for the people in the community, he supported her. He said, I support you in whatever you do because it's for the good of the people.
In February of 1922, Newt Knight dies. He is buried near Rachel, beneath a simple stone that reads, "He lived for others."
After Newton passed, they lost his protection. As long as he was the family patriarch, nobody really messed with him, with the families. But once he died, they didn't quite feel safe. They had a hard time. My grandfather's brother had a very successful store that he ran, and they had to pick up and leave all of that. They got run out of Jasper County because they, as my grandfather would say, forgot their place, and they had to leave. They started leaving Mississippi to find jobs, and they had a pretty good rudimentary education, and they were able to go off and as whites and get good jobs that they would not have been able to get if they had gone and said they were black.
During that time, that's just the way it was. You know, that's just the way it was. The lighter you married, the better off you would be in that society at that time. And so, you know, I don't know. It's changed, and then it has not changed. So you just, and it's not only in Mississippi. This is across the country. I've lived all over the United States just about, and it's just about the same. Right. You know.
In 1948, Davis Knight, the great-grandson of Newt and Rachel, is arrested, tried, and convicted for marrying outside his race.
It wasn't uncommon for this area for the descendants of Newt Knight. They looked just like any other white person. But, you know, there was always that 1/8 rule. And so they tended to marry white or cousins or whatever in order to try to marry this out. And I think that's a lot of what the Davis Knight trial was, to figure out whether or not he was black or white. That's what they were trying to do.
It's hard for people to understand it. It's very difficult to look like you're white and you go around saying, I'm black, but and people looking at you like, what do you mean? And as a child, when I was coming, and with my blue eyes and straight hair like I have, people would ask me, what are you? And if a white person made a mistake thinking I was white, and then they found out I wasn't, they would get upset. And I could never figure that out. It's not my fault. I didn't do it. It's not easy, unless you live in a community like where I lived, where there were a lot of people that looked like me. Well, everybody in the communities was related, black, white, green, or purple. They were all related.
Yes, everybody's related.
Yeah. The mentality of most of the people here who know about the Knights, the white Knights, the black Knights, and the half-white Knights. There's 3 sets of Knights here. And you start talking, they'll say, the older people say, just leave it alone. They don't want you to know.
But this new millennium generation, it's a little different now. And if we can go on Facebook, if you go on the Descendants of Newt Knight on Facebook, you see all colors on there. And they always say, we're all related, we are a family. All related, all related.
When I was going to school at Soso Elementary, I was on the basketball team and we won the state championship. And later on, I was just going through my pictures, it was 2 years ago, and I got to reading the names under the thing, and I was like, the Knight, the Crosby, the AGs, and then I went online and I started tracking who they were, and I was like, I'm related to these. And then I got to looking a little bit further down, and we were all related. I got in contact with 3 or 4 of them, and they said, yeah, I've always known we were related. And I was like, well, why didn't you tell me we were related? So they couldn't tell me because the African American side of the Knights were not allowed to tell us for some reason. I don't know if it was just the era we lived in, and us not knowing, you know, it made me mad, it really did. Because I felt close to them. I had this sense of family with all my classmates, and it was a family, and I didn't know it.
I have seen many students come through a system of education in history where they were transformed by it. They were changed. Many of them said, you know, we always thought Newt Knight was a traitor and that he did awful things. They're a new generation that's looking at Newt Knight with new eyes. And that takes education, and that takes an understanding of history.
I feel a whole lot better knowing my past than not knowing. It really brings me peace, and it gives me strength because they had such a struggle. And I think knowing that what they had to go through, things that I have to deal with from day to day or in my life, I know that I can do it too.
Sometimes our family reunions are like a beautiful rainbow, all shades of color just floating in the sky. Yes, we are a part of Newton Knight's actions, but it makes me proud to be a part of this historical and controversial family, no matter where it leads. Yes, our family tree branches are very complex. It does not matter which way the branches of the tree extend, it is always reaching upward and outward, gathering in all to form one giant tree.
Newt Knight is like a Rorschach test, you know, the psychological test where what do you see when you look at this picture? When people look at Newt Knight, whatever it is that they care most about is who Newt Knight becomes, whether they want to be inspired by him, whether they want to censure him, whether they think he's the most noble person who ever came along and, you know, a world saver, or whether they see him as the scourge of the South. Newt Knight's their man, and we would have had to invent him if he had not lived.
But who really knows the truth? You weren't there.
Mm-hmm. It's according to what you want to believe. We knew what he did for us. You know, that's why we have most of the land in this area, is because he left it to his children, and in turn it was left to us. And so we keep on passing it down. So he took care of both sides of his family, not only us, but the other side of his family too. We just can't claim him all ourselves, but he did take care of us.